January 21st, 2017 at a Blakers. I'm going to do a video here on this series of ponds. It's on the southern end of the property. And I thought I would start at the top of this particular little watershed and go through the thought process and the reasoning for all this stuff. So what we're going to look at is a whole series of little ponds. There's a metal tube there, just ignore that. But we start with one that's contained. This is where I can propagate a zola in the summer months to feed our chickens and keep that contained so it doesn't get released. You can see there's some floating in there. And then we've got a whole series of pond after pond after pond, all with different little purposes for propagation, for microclimate, all that sort of thing. But fundamentally it's about having a way to focus water in the landscape that I can then use, if needed, for the garden. That's where the main production garden is, just to the north of these ponds. And so that becomes better drained, and this becomes a source of water. And the soil that comes out of here was used to build raised garden beds. So you can see these lumps here make it even better drained and looser topsoil. So a couple different yields from the idea of making them. And what they do is they provide a context where I can do aquatic plants and water-loving plants. So in the second pond you can see I've stuck cuttings for elderberry. It's a variety called Scotia, and it goes all the way around the pond. So I'm propagating that elderberry in the muck soil on the edge of the pond, and it seems to really enjoy that. In the pond itself I've got water celery. We're in the middle of winter so you can't really see it right now, but in the summer this whole edge of the pond is just covered in lush green from this aquatic perennial vegetable. There's a water iris that's underwater right now. It's beautiful flowers in the middle of the summer. And then I've got a hybrid poplar from which I can take cuttings every spring. This is actually all regrowth from this season. So you can tell it really loves being in this pond. I can get about 40 or 50 cuttings from that plant every year. Speaking of cuttings, this is a snake willow or a curly willow that I stuck a pinky thick cutting, maybe a foot tall, I'd say 5 years ago, right in that spot. And that's how much it's grown since then. So having these wet spaces and focusing that water really makes for a wonderful growing condition for the right types of plants. I'm going to actually need to take cuttings. This is ready to get into the power lines there. So I'll be able to sell cuttings of those or propagate them around, whatever. Cattails, as per usual, they just showed up, which is interesting. They seem to always show up when I dig little ponds. But the idea is that as water moves through the landscape, so if I look up the watershed, there's a drainage ditch that I've dug that collects water from the whole southern end of the property. That's upslope, and as it comes through, periodically the water's going to run with a crazy amount of force. Each of the ponds are settling locations, so fertility and nutrient and soil can drop out of solution in every pond as it moves, and then periodically I can muck the bottom of the ponds and put that soil up onto these production beds. So this lump right here has Minaj Shmiru black currant, probably my favorite tasting black currant ever. You can see there's a bunch through here with sage and daikons and other herbaceous elements that are around it. This bed as well has Minaj Shmiru with a blue false indigo bush in the middle of it for nitrogen. That's a Morpha fructicosa. And again, you can see this pond, I just finished digging this last year. This is all hand dug with shovels and kind of just chip away at it. And so it doesn't really have vegetation in it yet. That'll happen pretty quickly, I'm sure. And since we're in a pretty open, sunny position, this is the southern edge of the property, and so the sun arcs through like crazy through here, this felt like a great opportunity to plant sea buckthorn. So I have a couple nice named varieties of seaberry in here. There's a male, which is cheesily called Lord, and a couple different varieties of females. So they're going to really enjoy the sun, and they don't love wet positions, so I planted them on top of these lumps so they can get a lot of good drainage, and they'll pump nitrogen into the soil as well and feed these other plants. This happens to be a little bit of a frost pocket in here, but seaberry, blackcurrant, they don't really mind. So that's a good use for them in here. And you can see again the water continues on down that trench. And then this is the bigger pond here. Tons of cattails growing, which I'm happy to see. It's a perennial vegetable and an interesting thing to propagate. But I can also dig it out and compost it if I need that. And along the edge of this is aronia and a couple different cultivar, well, there's more seaberry, and a couple cultivar raspberries and black cap raspberries. So there's purple royalty and jewel. I think I put a thornless blackberry in here as well. And just very, very light trellising hammered in. These are locust staves with wire, so I can weave these things through that. Makes a very nice like boundary space on the property, I find. Okay, so then this trench continues on down slope, and very intentionally you can see I've made lumps of soil periodically, so water can move through, but if it's really rushing through and there's soil in suspension, there's restrictions happening periodically rather than a straight run where I would have erosion and actually lose soil. So there's a lump there, another little trench and another lump with an iris to collect some of the fertility from that. And then this trench is set up to be able to grow watercress, so I can put in plugs of those in the spring with little bars periodically again to hold nutrient and soil. And then last but not least, before the water leaves this area, this is the lowest point. It's a relatively deep pond here. This holds an equivalent amount of water to this tank. I managed to get that tank for $50 on the side of the road. I don't know how I did it. 600-gallon tank, and I can set up a solar panel just to the south of it and put a bilge pump in this pond. This would be in the early spring, and lift water into this tank, and then have a hose from there. You can see that's the hose I use. That hose goes all the way over to the main garden and delivers water there. And where that's incredibly useful, so this farm runs exclusively on collected water. We don't use any wells to operate the nursery or the farm here. Periodically we'll have a spring where we get very little precipitation from the sky, but it's warm. And those scenarios, there's generally still groundwater here, until June or July. I can pump that water up with just a 12-watt bilge pump and then use gravity to deliver that over to the garden. So this becomes a nice source of water for irrigation. And since it's downslope of all these other beds, any lost nutrients that are leaching out are being pulled up by the pump into the tank and then sent directly into the garden, so they're not lost. Very important, if you're going to have water releasing from your landscape, to think about as many ways to slow it, spread it, sink it. Very fundamental permaculture principle there. And in this case, since we do have a trending towards wet property, I do need to allow it to leave, but I want to have it interact as much as possible before it does so. Another micro pond, and then out towards the road. It used to go directly to the right and into a ditch and away, but I cut a trench to send it northbound. It actually goes all the way. I won't go too far with this. It's for another time. But you can see it goes all the way through this long, long swale along the road and has a chance to be wicked up by all these beds down through the line there. So, whole series of ponds. I've been chipping away at making them for the last 6 or 7 years, and they're really doing some nice things. And that's just one of probably 10 or so setups like this at Edible Acres. Thanks for watching.